Hi, I'm Laura and this is Tropes Trilogy, and today I'll be discussing why you should be experimenting with your writing, structure, and formatting of your novel. One caveat is this doesn't actually just apply to novels. It can also apply to short stories and poetry. So, one thing I've noticed is I feel like when people discuss writing books, they often focus on the limitations of the medium. It's not visual like movies and it's not interactive like video games. I just think as writers, we should appreciate the form of writing more and be excited together to use our words to create powerful things, which I do think a lot of writers, especially here, talk about and believe. And I also think we shouldn't be afraid to experiment with our words. Sometimes when people give writing advice, they say to visualize it like a movie and write it so people can visualize it like a movie, which is fine advice. I do like to visualize scenes playing out in my head, and it's a fine comparison. However, that isn't the only way. Writing a book isn't a step to get a movie deal, and the actual craft of forming words into sentences, into scenes that move people and convey experiences isn't necessarily just doing it like a movie. Now, when writing, I do like to be able to visualize scenes, but that isn't my only goal. Through writing, we can describe many different senses that movies and video games cannot discuss. And words and how you choose to use them and not use them can evoke powerful emotions and experiences in ways that other mediums of art cannot. Which I'm sure a lot of you readers and writers out there know, considering how often the phrase, "the book was better than the movie," is said. So what are some examples of experimentation when writing books? It can be anything from writing an entire book in verse, to repeating a certain phrase or word throughout your story, to even having an unreliable narrator. All of these things are different ways you can experiment with your writing, and there are many ways that I probably have never thought of. However, I am going to give several examples of things I've read, written, or heard of. The first one is a very extreme example of experimentation, and that is Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. It is written entirely in the form of computer documents, which is an experiment within itself. However, this book takes it a step further by making some of these pages visually moving. There is a scene where multiple characters are sent off in smaller ships within the larger ship to fight, and the battle that ensues is written out on this page, each of these representing different things people said over the radio to each other. All the different radio messages of different sizes and colors and positions, with some of them even being sideways, creates a sense of chaos that overwhelms the reader. It shows how much is going on all at once. There is no beginning and there is no end. And by writing it in this way, it's able to convey a sense of chaos more than just saying it was chaos ever can. There are pages that are almost entirely blank, with the words following the path a character is taking on the outside of the ship. This book goes hardcore experimenting with words and pages and writing, and I love it for that. However, you don't have to go this hardcore, and to be honest, these were already established authors, and it probably would be difficult to start out with your first book being this experimental. Though I will say House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski is a debut novel, and it is the most experimental book I've ever heard of. I personally have not read it yet, but I have two friends who have, and it just sounds really crazy, and it would be hard for me to read, but I am interested in giving it a try and seeing different forms of fiction. But yes, that was a debut novel that was very experimental, so you can do it. It just may be a bit harder. I personally don't actually know. Maybe agents would more likely publish you because they're like, it's a shtick I can advertise. I don't know. An example of a book that did a smaller experiment is New Moon by Stephenie Meyer. There is a time period of several months where Bella Swan is depressed over losing Edward, and though the reasoning is kind of melodramatic, which causes people to make fun of these scenes, I actually think the way Stephenie Meyer wrote it was really interesting. And what she did was, instead of writing Bella was depressed over the passage of time and just summarize the time passed and Bella was sad and didn't do anything, she takes entire pages just to write the month, October, November, December, to depict how empty they were and how Bella felt nothing. Now, I admit I personally haven't read the series because a paranormal romance isn't really my thing. I'm not much of a romance person, so it's not for me. But I've seen a lot of people tease these scenes, and when I look at them and understand what they're trying to depict, depression and the feeling of emptiness, I actually appreciate them and what Stephenie Meyer was going for, whether or not it was well done or appropriate for why Bella was upset. I mean, to be honest, a lot of teenagers would get depressed after their first breakup though, so it does seem reasonable that she would feel really upset and empty inside. And I actually did see some people comment when I Googled about this scene on Reddit that they actually really appreciated this and it moved them and made them feel very strongly about everything that was happening, and some of them even related to it. A mom said that it reminded of her child who was going through her first breakup at the time, and so it actually was effective, and people found the simple use of leaving an entire page blank except for one word to be very powerful. And that's not that experimental, and it's just to demonstrate that not every experiment has to be crazy like Illuminae. And again, people made fun of it. Experimenting with writing isn't for everyone, and people will probably critique your experimentation if you do it. But if it's something you want to try or do, then go for it. And if you don't like how it turns out, you don't have to publish your experimentation. Another example that I did read was Reached by Ali Kandi, which was a book that, to be honest, wasn't my favorite. However, I liked the one thing it did with some experimentation. And that is, in the book, there was 3 point of views that would rotate in order every single time. And one of these characters gets a neurological disease that slowly decays his mind and makes him go into a coma. And reading these rotating chapters, his end up becoming shorter and shorter and more jumbled and harder to understand until finally his chapter is blank. This is a really clever and powerful way to use the rotations of character point of views that's extremely impactful. I remember reading a book where there was 2 characters' point of views rotating and then one of them died. And the next time it was supposed to be that character's point of view and they weren't there, that moment my heart just sank. I was like, wait, I didn't think they were dead, because I didn't think a YA book would kill off a protagonist. If you know what the book is, you know what I'm talking about. But the point is, using these structures that you put into your book in a clever way can have a big impact on your reader. Now, I have a couple smaller examples. One is from a short story that a classmate of mine wrote. In this story, he tried to convey a sense of being underwater, even though the book wasn't necessarily underwater. So throughout it, he used a lot of color imagery with blues and greens and chose to use words that reflected water and gave a sense of being sort of in a deep lagoon. And I think this gave this book a very unique sense of place and feeling that I absolutely loved. And again, I wrote another story where it wasn't as atmospheric. When it came to colors, I only ever described them as pale or light, dark, or the color red. And this was a purposeful decision to try to give a sense of eeriness and emptiness except for blood. And again, when I wrote this, to be honest, a lot of people didn't even notice that I did it, but it was something I chose to do to try to give my story a sense of atmosphere. And again, these were both short stories, and I think short stories are an especially great place to experiment. And another small thing I've done in my short stories that people seem to like is, in one of my short stories, I repeated a phrase multiple times. Actually, 2 of my short stories I did that, but the first one I also did that. And by repeating a phrase, by having it have different meanings throughout the story, that can again be a powerful thing that's experimenting with your words. And I encourage you not to just think of your story as a movie you're describing, but also consider the words and the way it looks on the page, and maybe try to experiment with verse or repetition or having blank pages that give a powerful sense of nothingness by choosing not to use words. Anyway, what are some creative writing experiments that you've read or written? What are your thoughts on experimenting with writing in general? Please tell me all your thoughts below, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.